I'm going to start this morning with a couple of quotes that I read to you a few weeks ago. First quote is this: I find no evidence whatsoever in the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels for any single doctrine of the atonement. And then the second quote: in the teaching of Jesus, the cross was never related in any way whatsoever to the forgiveness of the sins of humanity. And those quotes came from the late Ted Noffs. They're written in his book called By What Authority. And I referred to them in a sermon about a month ago, and I pointed out that both of those quotes were incorrect. It surprises me that he even made those statements. But these are not the only criticisms of Christianity that appear in Ted Noff's book. He also said that various Christian beliefs originated not with Jesus Christ, but with Paul. He said Paul changed Jesus' teachings. And I'll read to you another quote. Whenever I raised questions relating to the death of Jesus, people constantly quoted the Apostle Paul. Since I believe that most Christian thinking was sin-dominated, as opposed to the simple teachings of Jesus about human possibilities, it was necessary to free this kind of philosophy from the influence of people such as St. Paul. So Ted Noffs was saying when people talked about sin and salvation, they quoted Paul, and he said that's not right. We should be listening to what Jesus said. And it's not just people like Ted Noff. He reflected a theological view that was current back in, shall we say, the early part of the 20th century, the early half. Muslims also take the view that Paul, if you like, hijacked Christianity. They regard Jesus as a prophet, but a prophet within the sphere of Islam. And they believe that Paul took that and changed it. So I'm going to read to you 4 quotes from Nabil Qureshi's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And these are only 4 of a number of quotes. There's more quotes in that book along the same lines. First quote: Muslims are often trained to despise Paul, to see him as the hijacker of early Christianity. Quote 2: I had been repeatedly taught that Paul had corrupted Jesus' message, misleading billions into worshipping the mortal Messiah. Third quote: but somewhere very early in Christian history, people began to worship Jesus. That was anathema and blasphemy. Muslims are left with no recourse other than to place the blame on an early influential Christian outside the circle of disciples. Paul is that Christian. And then a 4th quote: Paul's the one who corrupted the Christian message. So the idea is that here in the New Testament you've got false teaching. Whether you take the views of Ted Noffs or Muslims, the idea is that the Bible is contradictory, that therefore it's not the true word of God. The idea is you've got one part of the Bible saying one thing about Jesus Christ, and you've got another part of the Bible saying something else about Jesus Christ. And that's why a few weeks ago I made the statement that I'm not too keen on red letter editions of the Bible, even though I've ended up with one here. My concern is that people will tend to view the red print, which is the words of Jesus, as being more authoritative, more reliable than other parts of the Bible. So it creates a separation. So we ask the question, is the Bible divided? Is it contradictory? Is it unreliable? And specifically for today's lesson, do the Apostle Paul's writings teach differently than, say, what Jesus said in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Remember, Paul wrote 13 letters from the book of Romans right through to Philemon. Well, first of all, we need to consider the subject of apostolic inspiration. Some might say that it was quite natural for the apostles to change Jesus' teaching. It wasn't that they intended to, they just couldn't help it. After all, how could the apostles remember exactly everything that Jesus had said to them and everything Jesus had done over a period of more than 3 years? And that's specifically so in regard to the fact that the apostles were preaching and writing up to 30 or 40 or maybe even more years after Jesus died. Indeed, the Gospel of John, the last of the Gospels, may have been written somewhere around AD 85 into the 90s perhaps, so anywhere up to 60 years after Jesus' death. So people say, look, they couldn't keep that exactly in their mind over all of that time. But Jesus anticipated that, and he wasn't expecting them to rely just upon their own memories. He gave them divine help in regard to this, and for that we go over, for instance, to John the 14th chapter, verses 25 and 26, where Jesus here is speaking to his disciples. John 14:25, these things I have spoken to you while remaining with you, but the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and remind you of all that I said to you. The Holy Spirit will guide you, will remind you. Or we can go over a little bit further to John the 16th chapter, beginning in verse 12. And again, this is Jesus talking to the apostles. I have many more things to say to you, but you cannot bear them at the present time. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. For he will not speak on his own, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will disclose to you what is to come. He will glorify me, for he will take from mine and will disclose it to you. But again, you notice in verse 13 that he will guide you into all the truth. So they had the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Incidentally, Muslims say that these are prophecies of Muhammad, that Muhammad was going to be the guide. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. But we do have a problem in quoting from the book of John, because there are people who say that John's gospel is unreliable simply because it was written so long after Jesus' death. And what's more, John's gospel differs from what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's got a lot of other material in it that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have. Now, people call that a contradiction. It's not a contradiction at all. It's just that John provides additional information. Now, as far as showing the reliability of the Gospel of John, that would be a separate sermon. Indeed, it would probably be several sermons. But I'm going to read to you a couple of quotes from the Illustrated Bible Dictionary, Part 2, page 805. This is the first quote. There is, in fact, a growing tendency to recognize that John contains important historical traditions about Jesus, and that an adequate understanding of his earthly life cannot be obtained from the synoptic gospels alone. And then another quote, F.F. Bruce can go so far as to say that there is no fundamental discrepancy between the Jesus of the synoptic gospels and of John. Now, F.F. Bruce was Ryland's professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at the Manchester University in England. And he's written various books on this. One of them that I've got at home, the New Testament documents, are they reliable? Professor Bruce in that devotes 15 pages to talking about how John's gospel is just as authentic an account of Jesus' life as are the other Gospels. So when John says here in John 14 and John 16 that Jesus told his apostles he would send them the Spirit to guide them, we can believe that. John's a reliable source of information. And what's more, he's not the only source of information on this, because if you're wary of John, and you shouldn't be, you can still go over to the book of Luke, and Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 11, and Luke gives us the same testimony here. And Luke chapter 12, verse 11, and this again is Jesus speaking to the disciples. Now, when they bring you before the synagogues and the officials and the authorities, do not worry about how or what you are to speak in your defense or what you are to say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say. So Luke again says Jesus predicted guidance from the Holy Spirit for the apostles. Now, that's the apostles. What about Paul? After all, Paul became an apostle later than the others. Was he guided by the Holy Spirit? Well, let's look at a couple of statements. One of them is over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 11 to 13. 2 Corinthians 12 verses 11 to 13. Paul here is talking to the Corinthians about problems within the congregation. He says, I have become foolish. You yourself compelled me. Actually, I should have been commended by you, since I was in no respect inferior to the most eminent apostles, even though I am a nobody. The distinguishing marks of a true apostle were performed among you with all perseverance by signs, wonders, and miracles. So there Paul is saying that he was able to give evidence of his apostleship through miracles, signs, wonders, and miracles. And the point can be made there that if the signs, the wonders, the miracles testify to him having the Holy Spirit, then they also testify to him being inspired. And that comes up a number of times in Paul's writings. For instance, we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. 2 and verse 12. Now we have not received the Spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may know the things freely given to us by God. We also speak these things not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual with spiritual. So Paul here says that the words that he teaches are taught by the Spirit. They're not a product simply of human wisdom. He gives a challenge about this over in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 37, having in that chapter talked about the use of spiritual gifts. He says in 14 verse 37, if anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that the things which I write to you are the Lord's commandment. So Paul says, if any of you have spiritual gifts, then you can recognize that what I'm saying to you is from God, because you have the spiritual ability to be able to do that. We go a little bit further to the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel which was preached by me is not of human invention, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So I didn't make this up myself, says Paul. And let's just go over to that passage which Ken read a while ago in Ephesians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles, if indeed you have heard of the administration of God's grace, which was given to me for you, that by revelation there was made known to me the mystery, as I wrote before briefly. By referring to this, when you read, you can understand my insight into the mystery of Christ, which in other generations was not made known to mankind, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit. To be specific, that the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and fellow partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel, of which I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me according to the working of his power. And it goes on. Paul here is talking about the mystery. He explains the mystery. The mystery was the idea that the Gentiles would share salvation with the Jews in Old Testament times. That was not understood. It was a mystery, but it had been revealed, says Paul, to the apostles and the prophets in the Spirit, verse 5. And Paul himself says in verse 3, by revelation there was made known to me the mystery. So Paul had the spiritual gifts himself, which testified that he had the Spirit, and he affirms repeatedly that what he is teaching is the gospel given through Jesus Christ. Well, you can say, yeah, but that's Paul's claim. Keep in mind, Paul showed his apostleship through spiritual gifts, but Paul's not the only one who testifies to the fact that he taught consistently with the gospel. We go back to the book of Galatians, and Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Paul is looking back here to the time when he went down to Jerusalem with others. This was the time described in Acts chapter 15, where there was an issue about the Judaizers trying to insist that Christian Gentiles also had to keep the old law. And Paul talks about what happened when he went down to Jerusalem to discuss this with the elders and the apostles. Chapter 2, verse 1, then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear, and it's those of reputation in the church, for fear that somehow I might be running or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And that again is referring to the arguments of the Judaizers. Verse 4, yet it was a concern because of the false brothers secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy on our freedom, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to enslave them to the old law. But we did not yield in subjection to them, even for an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But from those who were of considerable repute, what they were makes no difference to me, God shows no favoritism. Well, those who were of repute contributed nothing to me, but on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, in other words, the gospel to the Gentile, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, the Jews, for he was at work, he who was at work for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised was at work for me also to the Gentiles. God was working in both. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas, in other words Peter, and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised, to the Jews. Now there's a lot in there, but basically Paul is saying he went down to Jerusalem with others to discuss this whole matter of the Judaizers, and Paul there discussed with those in Jerusalem what he had been teaching to the Gentiles, and he said rather than him being told that he was wrong, the apostles, the elders down there in Jerusalem were in full agreement that he was teaching the truth. And he included James, Cephas and John there in the list of those who extended to him the right hand of fellowship. A mark of agreement, a mark that they're working together in all of this. So they affirm that Paul was teaching the same gospel. And you've got a bit more from Peter over in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. 2 Peter 3, verses 15 and 16. And regard the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, wrote to you, as also in all his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which there are some things that are hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the scriptures, to their own destruction. So Peter here refers to Paul as our beloved brother, again showing consensus, showing agreement. And I want you to notice towards the end of verse 16 here, he said, there are some things in Paul's writings hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the scriptures. Now, when Peter says the rest of the scriptures, what is he doing? He's including Paul's writings with the scriptures. There's Paul's writings, and then there's the rest of the scriptures, and Peter's putting them all together. And scripture, it says in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16, is inspired by God. So you've got supporting testimony from Peter and from others to the effect that Paul was not teaching anything different. Paul was in agreement with what the other apostles were teaching, because they were all guided by the Holy Spirit. So are there contradictions between what Paul says in one part of the New Testament and what Jesus says in the Gospels? Well, let's have a look at a few examples. That's all I've got time for here. There's many more that I've got written down, but we're only going to have a look at a few. Let's go back to Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. This is the subject of where Jesus came from and where he went back to. Now, this is what Paul had to say. Philippians 2, beginning in verse 5. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, as he existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. And we've talked about that. He did not consider equality with God something to be clutched at, because he already had it. Verse 7, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant, and being born in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, death on a cross. But what's it saying here? That Jesus Christ was with God, but he didn't hold on to that. He came to earth in the form of a human being. So he was in heaven before he came to earth. And then he went back. How do you know he went back? Well, various passages tell you that, but to give you an example, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul is talking here about Christ's return, and chapter 4 and verse 16 of 1 Thessalonians, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven. And if he's descending from heaven, then it means when he left earth the first time, he went back to heaven, and then one day he's going to come again. So according to Paul, Christ existed in heaven before coming to earth, and then went back to heaven. That's what Paul says. What does Jesus say? We'll go over to John 16 and verse 28 there. Jesus here talking to his disciples. I came forth from the Father and have come into the world. Again, I am leaving the world and going to the Father. So what Jesus said there is what Paul said. And of course, somebody might say, oh yeah, but you're quoting from the Gospel of John. I've already briefly pointed to the fact that the Gospel of John is just as reliable as the other Gospels. So what Jesus said about where he came from and where he went back to is the same as what the Apostle Paul taught. No contradiction. What about the divinity of Christ? Let's go over to Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15 and see what Paul had to say there. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15. This is Paul writing, talking to Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn, in other words, the preeminent one of all creation. And we've talked about that verse in the past. But Christ is the invisible God made visible. That's the idea there. Also, if you have a look at chapter 2 and verse 9 of Colossians, for in him, in Christ, all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. Nothing lacking. So Paul testifies to the divinity of Jesus Christ. What about Jesus? Does he say anything? Excuse me, I'm trying to sneeze. I'm not going to. John chapter 8, verses 56 to 59. There's actually a number of passages we could refer to. I've chosen this one for convenience. This is Jesus talking, John 8 and verse 56. Your father Abraham, is speaking to the Jews, was overjoyed that he would see my day, and he saw it and was rejoiced. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham, because Abraham had lived roughly 2,000 years beforehand. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. And we've talked about this passage many times. You could say, well, it's just Jesus using bad grammar. Before Abraham was born, I am. However, we go back to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14, the burning bush, where God speaks to Moses, tells Moses to go back to Egypt and to talk to the Israelites there. And Moses has said, well, who do I say has sent me? God says, tell them that I am has sent you. That's part of God's name, Yahweh. Jesus here, by calling himself I am, which appears ungrammatical, has greater significance. He's using the name of God for himself. You say, oh, that's just a coincidence. Well, the Jewish listeners didn't hear it that way. Verse 59, therefore they picked up stones to throw at him. And I don't mean little stones here. When they stoned a person, their intent was killing him. They used big stones. Why was that? Because they considered Jesus to be speaking blasphemy because he used the name for himself that was applied to God. And again, people say, well, maybe that wasn't Jesus' intention. Well, if it wasn't his intention, why didn't he say so? He could so easily have said, no, that's not what I mean. He didn't. There's several other occasions where similar things happen. Jesus doesn't change what he has said. He stands by it. So what Paul says about Jesus' divinity is what Jesus says about his divinity. I could use one more example very quickly. Paul on the significance and the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through to 4. Romans 1 verse 1, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. The resurrection happens, says Paul, and it affirms who Jesus Christ was and is. That's what Paul says. What about Jesus? Did he say anything on the matter of his resurrection? Well, we'll go to Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through to 40. Matthew 12:38. Some of the scribes and the Pharisees said to him, to Jesus, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign. That's a miraculous evidence that's providing proof of something. And an evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and so no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was in the stomach of the sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Someone might say, yeah, but how do you know he's talking there about his resurrection? All right, let's go over to Matthew chapter 16 and verse 21. This is Jesus speaking, Matthew 16 and verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and to suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and to be killed and to be raised up on the third day. So just as Paul said Jesus was resurrected, thus proving his identity, so Jesus said his resurrection was part of proving his identity. It was a sign. So again, no difference. That's 3 areas in these notes. I went through 11 areas, just thinking of topics as they came to mind, and there's many more beside that, where Paul can be shown to be teaching exactly what is taught by Jesus in the Gospels. There is no discrepancy. So, Paul did not change Jesus' teaching. In the Bible, the Pauline epistles are consistent with the Gospels, just as the Gospel of John is consistent with the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There is unity there. Paul did not hijack Christianity. He did not alter the teachings of Jesus. He didn't invent a different faith. It is inaccurate to say in this regard that certain parts of the Bible are in contradiction to other parts, and therefore the Bible is not from God. The evidence does not support that. If you look at it openly, honestly, thoughtfully, you will see that the Bible provides unity, demonstrates unity. It goes together. That supports the idea that it comes from God. That's consistent with the idea that it comes from God. If it all comes from God, then you would expect it to harmonize. So what do we need to do? We need to take it seriously. If you're not sure, then check the facts. There's lots and lots of material to help you do that. But recognize that this Bible is unified, that it is the Word of God, and that it is the reliable guide to life, salvation, and eternity. Commit yourself to reading it, to studying it, to thinking about it, and to living it. Let's stand and sing.